There's a specific moment that happens multiple times every single session. And before I describe it, I want you to try to locate it yourself somewhere in the texture of your last few sessions, because the fact that you can locate it is most of the point. It's not a bad beat. It's not a cooler. It's not the hand where you got it in good and lost to a two-outer and had to sit with that for the next 20 minutes. You know that feeling and you've made your peace with it, or at least you've learned to perform peace with it. This is different. This is quieter. It's a hand where the pot is medium-sized, the decision is genuinely marginal, and somewhere in the middle of processing it. Not at the beginning when you're still running the calculation, but somewhere in the middle when the calculation is mostly done. You feel something that isn't quite fear and isn't quite doubt. It's a low-grade resistance, an ambient reluctance that doesn't have a clean label. And you take the line that makes it go away. You call instead of raising. You check back instead of continuing. You fold instead of floating into a spot that might develop into something. The hand ends. The pot wasn't big enough to hold your attention for more than a few seconds. You're already reading the next hand before this one is fully resolved. That hand happened 4 times tonight. It happened the session before that. It's been happening in forms you've gotten genuinely skilled at not noticing across most of the serious poker you've played. I want to spend the next 10 minutes on that pattern, not on the dramatic version of poker psychology, not the obvious tilt, not the clearly tilted player who everyone at the table can see falling apart, but on this quieter version, the one that operates without symptoms. The one that produces results that don't match your understanding of the game and leaves you with explanations that are technically accurate and completely insufficient. Variance, card dead, the field running good, the rake. You've run through all of them. None of them fully account for the gap. This video is about what does account for it, why this pattern exists at a level deeper than strategy, what it's actually costing when you add it up honestly, what it has to do with decisions you make every day that have nothing to do with cards, and the one specific internal adjustment that changes it, not a system, not a chart, not another thing to study, but a single quality of attention applied at the exact moment the leak is active. If this lands the way I think it will, you're going to recognize something in yourself that you've felt many times without ever having the language for it. And once you have the language, you have the choice. That's the only thing on offer here. Not a guarantee. A choice you couldn't fully make before, because you didn't know exactly what you were choosing between. Let me describe the mistake with the kind of precision that's actually useful, because vague descriptions of psychological leaks produce vague recognition that changes nothing. The mistake is not a single decision. It's a category of decisions that share one root cause, distributed across an entire session in spots small enough that no individual instance registers as a problem. You will not find this leak in your hand history. It doesn't show up as a specific spot type that you can isolate and study. It shows up in the aggregate, in the gap between what your technical understanding of the game should produce and what your results actually produce over a large enough sample that variance has had time to average out. The root cause is this. You are regularly, in marginal situations throughout every session, choosing the decision that reduces your immediate emotional discomfort over the decision that maximizes your expected value. Not dramatically. Not in the big pots where you're fully engaged and the stakes of being wrong feel high enough to force honest analysis. In the medium pots, the marginal spots, the decisions that don't feel important enough to scrutinize. Here's what the arithmetic looks like across a real session. You have top pair on the river against a player you've been reading as weak throughout the hand. The correct bet is substantial, somewhere between 60 and 80% of pot. But a substantial bet creates a substantial pot, and a substantial pot means this hand becomes a hand worth remembering, and you're not quite certain enough of your read to want this hand to become a hand worth remembering. So you size down. You put out 40% instead of 70. You get called, you win, everything seems fine. The value you left on that street is somewhere between $25 and $40. It will never appear anywhere as a loss because it was never in your stack to begin with. You have a semi-bluff opportunity on the turn. The equity calculation is clean, strong draw, some fold equity, positive expected value over any honest accounting of the situation. But the session has some weight to it right now. You're not down badly, but you're not comfortable. And there's a story forming about tonight that this bet would add a difficult chapter to if it goes wrong. So you check it back. Somewhere between $30 and $50 in expected value quietly disappears. You're facing a player who has been playing too loosely for 2 hours. You have the hand and the position to 3-bet for value and size, to build a pot that you should be happy to play for stacks. But 3-betting here means a real pot, and a real pot means your read gets tested with real consequences, and right now real consequences don't feel like something you want, so you flat. You play the hand from the wrong position in a pot that was yours to shape. None of these hands make it into your review. None of them feel like mistakes while they're happening. Each one comes equipped with an explanation that sounds almost like strategy, and taken together across a 4-hour session, you have surrendered somewhere between $150 and $250 to a single unnamed mechanism that operated the entire time without ever announcing itself. 200 sessions a year. The arithmetic is yours to do. Here's the reason this is more expensive than tilt in the traditional sense, and why the players who fix their obvious tilt often find that their results don't improve as much as the fix should have produced. When you're tilting in the way most people mean, the visible kind, the kind with heat behind it, the kind where you can feel yourself slightly outside your normal process, there's a signal. It's not always a clear signal, and it doesn't always arrive early enough to be useful, but it's present. Experienced players learn to recognize it. They build structures around it. They leave the table, walk around, reset. The signal makes the problem at least visible, which makes it at least addressable. The mistake I'm describing produces no signal. It produces the exact opposite of a signal. When you take the smaller bet instead of the correct one, your brain does not send you an alert that reads, "Fear just made that decision." Your brain sends you something that reads more like, "You're being measured tonight. You're not overcommitting. You're staying within yourself. You're playing the kind of patient, disciplined poker that the good players talk about." This is the specific feature that makes the leak so persistent. Bad decisions that feel like bad decisions are correctable. You can identify them, study them, build awareness around them, and over time reduce their frequency. Bad decisions that feel like good decisions don't get identified. They don't get studied. They accumulate for years, each one individually indistinguishable from actual wisdom, while the graph trends slightly worse than your understanding of the game can explain. What is actually happening underneath that feeling of measured discipline is something more specific, and understanding it precisely is the difference between this video being something you agreed with once and something that actually changes a pattern. Over the course of a session, you accumulate emotional residue. Not catastrophically. The hand where your read was wrong and you had to watch someone table exactly the hand you convinced yourself they didn't have. The marginal call early in the session that went against you and that you filed under variance, but that left a trace. The small pot you misplayed 20 minutes ago that you handled with perfect visible composure, and that is nonetheless still present somewhere in the background of your processing. None of these are consciously active when you make your next decision, but they are active. They're doing something that the research on sequential decision-making has documented in detail, and that poker players almost never discuss in these terms. They are raising the emotional cost of being wrong. When the session is clean and you feel settled, being wrong in a marginal spot costs you almost nothing emotionally. You fire the bet, it doesn't work, it's a data point, you continue. But when the session has accumulated weight, when there is already a narrative forming about the direction of tonight, being wrong in the same marginal spot costs more. It becomes another entry in a story that's already moving in a direction you don't want. And your brain, which is very motivated to protect the narrative of your competence, starts quietly steering decisions away from situations that could add new negative entries, smaller sizes, passive lines and spots that warrant aggression, conservative choices that arrive with just enough strategic-sounding justification that you never quite question them. The strategy bends toward emotional safety. The bending feels like adjustment. The adjustment feels like wisdom. The wisdom is slowly costing you everything the variance already isn't. Before I go further into the mechanics, I want to name the thing underneath the thing, because there's a layer here that most poker psychology content never reaches, and it's the layer that actually determines whether this pattern is fixable for you or whether it runs for another few years. The deeper mechanism is ego protection. Not ego in the simple, arrogant sense, in the structural sense, in the sense that you have built, over years of serious engagement with this game, a self-concept that includes being a competent, thoughtful, difficult-to-exploit player. That self-concept is real. It's based on real study and real results and real investment of time and attention. And like any real thing, it can be threatened. The decisions that create the most emotional cost, the ones your brain most wants to avoid, are not the ones that lose money. They're the ones that produce visible, unambiguous evidence that your judgment was wrong in a specific spot. There is a meaningful difference between losing chips to variance, which the self-concept can absorb without damage, and losing chips to a clearly identified mistake, which the self-concept experiences as a wound. The large value bet on the river that gets raised and folds you out isn't just a financial event. It's a test of your read, and a test you might fail publicly at a table where other players are watching. The semi-bluff on the turn that gets called and doesn't get there isn't just a chip loss. It's evidence that you assessed the situation incorrectly, that you fired into a spot that didn't support it, that your read of the fold equity was wrong. The 3-bet that turns into a difficult multi-street spot isn't just a risk. It's an opportunity for the self-concept to take damage in a way that the flat never would. So the brain, operating with a speed and efficiency that bypasses conscious awareness entirely, starts filtering decisions through a secondary criterion that has nothing to do with expected value, not just what is the highest EV line, but also what is the line least likely to produce clear evidence that my judgment was wrong. The answer to that second question is almost always the passive line. The smaller bet, the fold, the check back, the flat. Because passive lines have diffuse outcomes, you can always construct a narrative where the passive line was appropriate. Aggressive lines have clear outcomes. You get called and you're wrong, and everyone at the table, including you, knows it. This is not weakness. This is the human brain doing precisely what it evolved to do. Protect a stable sense of self-concept from evidence that might damage it. The cost of that protection at a poker table is enormous, and the protection operates whether you want it to or not. I want to connect this to something outside poker for a few minutes, and I want to do it precisely rather than metaphorically, because the connection I'm drawing is not a rhetorical one. It's structural. Think about a situation in your current life, not a complex ethical question, something practical and concrete, where you have known the correct decision for a while. A conversation you need to have with someone that you've been finding reasons to delay for longer than you can honestly justify. A professional move you've analyzed carefully and know is the right risk to take, but that would expose you to the possibility of visible failure in a way that the current situation doesn't. A financial decision, a career decision, a personal situation where staying is clearly costing you more over time than leaving would, but leaving requires tolerating a specific uncomfortable period that has been easier to defer than to enter. You have the information. You've had it. The reason you haven't taken the correct action isn't that you lack knowledge or clarity. It's the same reason you took the smaller bet on the river. The immediate emotional cost of being wrong, of having the difficult conversation that might not go well, of taking the professional risk that might produce visible failure, of making the decision that requires tolerating a painful short-term period. That cost, experienced right now in the present moment, exceeded the expected value of the correct action experienced over time. So you flatted. You checked back. You sized down to avoid the spot where your judgment gets tested with real consequences. The parallel is not poetic, it's mechanical. The same cognitive pattern that makes you undersize the value bet when the session has weight makes you stay in situations longer than you should when exiting requires a conversation that might be difficult. The same mechanism that makes you avoid the semi-bluff when you're not quite even makes you avoid the professional risk you've assessed as correct, but that carries real downside. The emotional tax gets collected in every domain where decisions carry stakes and where being wrong has consequences for how you see yourself. And it compounds in every domain. The small costs of emotional safety don't announce themselves as costs at the moment they're paid. They feel like prudence. They feel like patience. They feel like being appropriately measured. But accumulated across months and years, in a career and in relationships and in the gap between the life you were capable of building and the one you've built while protecting yourself from the specific feeling of being clearly wrong, The total is staggering, and unlike poker, most of those domains don't have a hand history you can pull up and audit. Poker makes the cost visible in a way that almost nothing else does. That's one of the things the game is genuinely valuable for, independent of any money made or lost. If you're willing to read the data honestly, it shows you a pattern that is operating everywhere. Now let me talk about the fix. And I want to be careful here, because the instinct when you identify a leak is to build architecture around it. A checklist. A rule you recite before decisions. A system you run in real time. The appeal of architecture is that it feels like it converts insight into guaranteed behavior change. And it almost never does. Systems don't survive sessions. They survive review sessions. They survive the first 20 minutes when you're fresh and the emotional residue is zero, and the full deliberate part of your brain is online and running. They don't survive hour 3 when the session has weight and the next decision needs to happen in the next several seconds, and the part of your brain that runs checklists has partially gone offline because it's expensive to operate, and the session is costing more than the usual amount to manage. What survives sessions is simpler. It has to be simple enough to operate with partial cognitive resources, under emotional load, in real time. It has to be something that can run in 2 or 3 seconds without requiring you to remember a framework. What I'm going to describe is a question, one question, applied in a specific moment with an honest answer required. The specific moment is identifiable. It has a texture, the low-grade resistance I described at the start of this video, the ambient reluctance that arrives in marginal spots, the pull toward the safer line that doesn't have a clean strategic explanation, but that your brain is actively trying to generate one for. When you feel that texture, you ask the question. The question is, am I considering this line because the analysis supports it, or because it protects me from being visibly wrong? One question. Honest answer only. No partial credit for answers that are technically true but omit the emotional component. If the honest answer is the first one, if you can actually walk yourself through the strategic reasoning that supports the conservative line, reasoning that stands independently of how the session has been going or what your stack currently represents to your self-concept, then take it. Conservative is correct in many spots. Patient is correct in many spots. The question is not telling you to be aggressive. It's asking you to be honest about what's actually driving the decision. If the honest answer is the second one, if you notice when you look at it directly that the safer line's primary virtue is that it removes your emotional exposure rather than maximizing your expected value, then you found it, right there, in the hand, before it costs you anything. And the presence of the finding gives you a choice that the unexamined version of this moment didn't offer. You can still take the safer line, but now you're choosing it consciously rather than having it chosen for you. That distinction between a decision made and a decision that happened to you is the whole thing, and the pause the question creates, 2 or 3 genuine seconds of inquiry rather than the reflex that would have fired without it, is enough to make that distinction available. And there's a version of this fix that sounds simple and is genuinely difficult, and I want to acknowledge that directly rather than leaving you with the impression that asking one question in real time is going to feel easy for the first few sessions. It won't. The reason it won't is that honesty about the emotional driver of a decision requires catching the moment before the rationalization has fully formed, and rationalizations form fast. By the time you're consciously processing a decision, the emotional conclusion has often already been reached, and the strategic-sounding justification is already being assembled to support it. What feels like thinking through a spot is sometimes the intellectual packaging of a decision that was made faster than thinking operates. The question works by creating a small interruption in that process, not eliminating it. You cannot prevent your brain from generating the emotional conclusion and then building justification around it. But you can learn to catch the justification while it's still being built, before it has solidified into something that feels like analysis. The signal is the resistance. When you feel the resistance and then almost immediately feel a strategic reason forming for the conservative line. When the reason arrives a little too quickly, a little too conveniently. That sequence is the tell. The question gets easier with repetition. The first 20 times you ask it honestly, it will be uncomfortable. You're catching yourself in the middle of a process your brain would very much prefer to complete without examination. That discomfort is the signal that it's working. After 100 times, the question operates faster. After a few hundred, it starts to operate automatically in spots where the leak used to run automatically. This is not a transformation. It's a recalibration. Slowly, the gap between your strategic understanding of the game and your actual behavior under emotional load begins to close. Not because you've become a different kind of person, because you've built a specific habit of attention in the specific moment where the pattern was previously invisible to you. The graph changes, not dramatically after one session. Over time, in the direction the analysis always said it should go, with less of the unexplained drag that variance and rake and bad luck were never quite enough to account for. That's the full scope of the fix. One question, applied honestly. At the moment the signal appears, repeated until it runs on its own. If you've watched this far, I want to talk to you directly for a moment about something that most channels wouldn't say this plainly. Making content like this, not content designed to generate a reaction, but content trying to actually change how someone thinks about something real, takes a specific kind of investment. The research is real. The thinking behind the structure is real. The attempt to find the precise language that makes a concept land rather than just pass through takes time that other kinds of videos don't require. What determines whether that investment is sustainable is simple, and it's worth being transparent about. The algorithm, not YouTube in some abstract corporate sense, but the specific system that decides whether a video like this one reaches 1,000 people or 100,000. That system doesn't evaluate quality of thinking. It evaluates engagement signals, likes, watch time, comments, shares. Those signals are what tells the distribution system that this content is worth showing to people who haven't found the channel yet. So here's what I want to ask you, and I want to ask it without pressure, because the last thing I want to do is perform the desperation that the model of asking requires. If something in this video shifted something for you, if any part of the last 15 minutes gave you a clearer picture of a pattern you've been living with but couldn't name, the most direct way you can support more of this is to take 30 seconds right now. Like the video. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm this content is worth distributing. Leave a comment if something landed, even a short one. Comments signal engagement in a way that matters for reach. Share it with one person you know who plays seriously and has been stuck somewhere they can't explain, because they probably have this same pattern running and the video will do the same work for them that it hopefully did for you. Subscribe if you want to stay in this conversation. Not as a favor. Because the content that comes next is part of the same inquiry, and if this one was worth your time, the inquiry is probably worth continuing. That's all. No guilt. No performance of gratitude. Just an honest ask from a channel trying to reach the people it's actually built for. Here's something I want to name before we close, because it reframes everything I've described in a way that I think matters. The mistake I've spent this video analyzing, the pattern of small, emotionally driven decisions that quietly cost serious players hundreds of dollars per session, is not a poker problem in any fundamental sense. Poker is just the environment where it becomes visible, where the cost can be quantified, where the hand history exists, and the tracking software runs, and the numbers eventually tell the story that the individual sessions were too small to tell. Most areas of life where this pattern operates don't offer that clarity. The career where you've been taking the smaller bet for years, staying in the position that doesn't require you to be tested in a way that might produce visible failure, doesn't produce a graph you can audit. The relationship where you've been checking back the semi-bluff for months because the conversation required would force your read of the situation into the open doesn't produce a session review. The creative or professional risk you've been flatting instead of 3-betting doesn't show up in any data you have access to. The cost is real. It's just invisible in the way that most costs of emotional safety are invisible. Diffuse, spread across time, accumulated quietly, explainable at any individual moment as reasonable prudence or appropriate patience. Poker makes it visible. That's one of the things the game is actually good for, if you're willing to use it that way. Not as a place to make money despite the psychological patterns, as a laboratory where the psychological patterns reveal themselves with unusual precision and can be examined with unusual honesty. The question we talked about, am I considering this line because the analysis supports it or because it protects me from being visibly wrong, is portable. It works at the table in the marginal spots where the emotional residue is shaping the decision. It works in the professional context where the risk has been analyzed as correct, but the downside is visible. It works in the personal context where the correct action requires tolerating a specific discomfort that feels more present than the long-term cost of avoiding it. You already know the right answer in most of those situations. The knowledge was never the problem. The gap between knowing and doing, specifically doing under the conditions that make doing costly, that's the only gap that's ever actually mattered. And it's closable. Not through a new system or a new framework or more time in a solver, through a new quality of honesty applied at the specific moment the pattern is active. That's it. That's the whole thing. And I want to close this the way I think it deserves to be closed. Not with a summary, not with a repetition of the main points, but with the one thing I hope you carry out of this video and into your next session. The pattern we've been talking about has been running in your game for a long time. Not because you're undisciplined, not because you lack the knowledge to play better, not because the stakes are wrong or the sample is too short or the field is tougher than it used to be. It's been running because it's quiet, because it feels like it's opposite, and because nobody ever handed you the language to catch it in real time. You have the language now. The next session, something will happen, probably in the first hour, possibly in the first 20 minutes, where the pattern activates. You'll feel it, the resistance, the pull toward the line that makes the next few minutes more comfortable at the cost of the line that makes the most sense. And for the first time, you'll have access to the choice in real time rather than in retrospect. What you do with that access is yours to decide. The question doesn't make the correct play easy. Nothing makes correct play under emotional load easy. That's the whole point of why this leak exists in the first place. But the question makes the correct play available, visible, choosable. And available, visible, and choosable is everything. That's the entire distance between a pattern that runs for another year and one that starts to close. Take that into your next session, not as a rule to follow, as a quality of attention to practice. Return to it when the pattern activates. Be honest when the answer is uncomfortable. Over time, the honesty becomes cheaper, the pattern becomes less frequent, and the graph starts to do what your understanding of the game always suggested it should. If this conversation was worth your time, the channel will be here for the next one. Everything in this series is built around the same question from different angles. Why does understanding the game and playing the game remain two different things for most serious players? And what does that gap actually consist of? That's the inquiry. Come back when you want more of it.